Hey guys, today we begin with a story wrapped in snow and silence, a story that moves not with speed, but with stillness. It's a tale born in the quiet winter of old Japan, where honor was colder than the wind and loyalty ran deeper than time. This is not a story of loud battles or swift revenge. It is a story of waiting, of choosing not to act until the moment was right, no matter how long the seasons turned, of keeping a promise even when the world forgot why it mattered. We follow 47 men, not kings, not legends, not gods, just samurai, warriors without a master, left behind after a single quiet injustice. For 2 long years, they lived among the people as monks, laborers, merchants, their swords hidden, their purpose buried deep within. But beneath the surface of ordinary life, a flame remained. It did not roar. It did not spread. It simply burned, steady, cold, and bright. Tonight, you'll walk alongside them. You'll step through narrow alleys under pale lantern light. Hear the crunch of footsteps in fresh snow. Feel the weight of silence in rooms lit only by oil lamps. You'll learn how honor can be quiet, how justice can wait, and how a single act, done slowly, carefully, with reverence, can echo for centuries. So settle in. Let the fire crackle. Let your breath slow with the rhythm of the snow, and let the tale unfold like tea leaves in warm water, gently, fully, patiently. This is the legend of the 47 Ronin. Before you settle in and get comfortable, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I'm doing here. In the comments, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. It's always fascinating to see our sleepy little myth-loving community stretch across the world. And if there's a particular myth, legend, or story you'd love to hear next, share it below. I'm always listening. Now, dim the lights, let your thoughts slow down, and let's drift gently into tonight's story. Before the vengeance, before the sword was drawn, before the snow was stained, there was quiet, deep, sacred quiet. In the heart of Edo, now known as Tokyo, the year was 1701. The air, though still touched by spring, held the memory of winter, its final breath woven into the thin mist rising from the early morning streets. Lanterns swayed gently above narrow stone paths, their light faint beneath a sky not yet fully lit. Shops had not opened, and the chatter of the day had not begun. Everything was held in a moment of stillness, a city asleep with eyes half open, far from the city's bustle. In a region lined with soft, undisturbed hills and cedar-covered slopes, sat the castle of Lord Asano Naganori. His province of Eiko was not the wealthiest nor the largest, but it was respected, known for its discipline, its order, its peaceful governance. Lord Asano himself was a young daimyo, quiet, intelligent, and shaped by a strong sense of duty that often made him appear older than his years. He ruled, not with extravagance, but with restraint, a trait admired by some and misunderstood by others. His home stood on raised wooden stilts above a polished courtyard raked with careful precision into waves of white gravel. The lines curved gently, mimicking the flow of water, guiding the eye and the mind toward serenity. The shoji screens that formed the outer walls of the main hall were always drawn in the early morning, allowing the pale light to slip softly through the rice paper, illuminating the polished tatami mats and wooden beams with a kind of reverence. Outside, pine trees leaned in over the outer walls, their needles whispering in the wind like old monks in conversation. Lord Asano awoke early, before the birds. His servant had already prepared hot water and a modest breakfast, a bowl of steamed white rice, miso soup with tofu and wakame, and 3 pickled plums arranged carefully like punctuation on a ceramic plate. The wooden tray was simple, unadorned, and the lacquered bowl warm to the touch. He sat in silence and ate slowly, as was his custom. Each bite not rushed, each moment part of a rhythm he followed without thinking. His thoughts moved like his tea, calm, deliberate, steeping in the traditions that guided him. On this morning, he was preparing to leave for Edo Castle. The shogun had summoned him and several other lords to assist with a formal reception for imperial envoys, an event of great importance. And for this, the young lord would need to learn the precise rituals of court etiquette. The details were strict: how to bow, how to walk, how to hold a fan, how to speak. One wrong gesture could be seen as an insult. For that, the shogunate had assigned an official to teach the lords proper court behavior, a man named Kira Yoshinaka. Now, Kira was of noble rank, but not of noble spirit. His position was ceremonial, but he wielded it with arrogance. His expectations were veiled in subtle cruelty. It was well known that he expected bribes and gifts, lavish offerings from those he taught in exchange for his favor. Those who pleased him received gentle correction. Those who did not were shamed. Lord Asano, with his unwavering sense of duty and integrity, refused to bribe the man. It was beneath his honor, beneath the soul of the samurai. So he arrived in Edo without offerings, believing his sincerity and humility would be enough. In the moonlit corridors of the castle, he walked with quiet resolve, dressed in a subdued kimono of dark green and ash gray. His sandals left almost no sound as he stepped across the polished floors. At Edo Castle, the atmosphere was a delicate mix of beauty and pressure. Each hall was lined with silk scrolls and gold leaf paintings of cranes, chrysanthemums, and mountains that seemed to move with the flicker of candlelight. The walls themselves felt like they listened. Servants moved silently, like shadows, their feet trained never to echo. The air smelled of sandalwood and pine, and something else, the faint scent of ink on paper and the dust of politics. Asano and Kira met in a chamber with tatami flooring and a single scroll depicting Mount Fuji. Kira's robes were bold, embroidered with golden patterns of dragons and clouds, his fan made from silver-rimmed bamboo. He looked at Asano with thinly veiled disdain, noting the lack of tribute. His instructions were clipped, his corrections sharp. He spoke to Asano as if the young lord were a boy, not a daimyo. Day by day, the tension grew. Asano endured the insults with stoic silence. He returned to his quarters and sat alone by the oil lamp, the shadows of pine branches dancing across the floor. He would sip tea brewed with care, the earthy bitterness reminding him of mountains back home. His retainer, Uishi Yoshio, who had not accompanied him but remained in Akko, was in his thoughts often a man of wisdom, of calm leadership, and loyalty. Asano knew that if Oishi were here, he would counsel patience, but patience has limits. Even the snow that falls gently can become a crushing weight if it does not melt. One morning, Kira humiliated Asano in front of the other lords, questioning his birth, his manners, his province. The words were sharp, deliberate, spoken like blades dipped in honey. Asano stood in silence, but his hands trembled. Not from anger, not yet, but from the unbearable clash of duty and insult. The samurai code, Bushido, demanded honor, but the shogunate forbade violence within the castle walls. The sword on his hip was not just a weapon, It was a symbol of his soul. And now that soul was being tarnished by a man who had no honor at all. That night, the wind in the pines outside his chamber sounded different, harsher. Asano sat in Seiza, his legs folded beneath him, staring at the paper lantern's flickering light. His thoughts moved like leaves in a fast river tumbling over each other. The code of Bushido does not allow a man to ignore insult, and yet it also forbids violence in sacred halls. There was no clear path, only the cold stone of honor beneath his feet. Tomorrow, everything would change. The morning that followed was overcast, not in the way of storm or rain, but in that heavy, soundless way that made the world seem like it had been wrapped in thin cotton. Even the birds seemed reluctant to sing. The sun hung low, a pale and distant shape beyond a ceiling of gray. Edo Castle, though ever busy with its silent rhythm of etiquette and administration, carried a tension in the air that few could name and fewer could ignore. Every hallway, every sliding door seemed to hold its breath. Lord Asano dressed with care. His robes were dark blue with subtle patterns of pine needles along the sleeves, a reflection of home, of his quiet province, of the hills and the trees that knew his footsteps. He tied his hakama slowly, pausing once to look into the mirror of polished bronze placed upon the lacquered stand. His face was calm, but there, behind the eyes, rested something heavier than sleep. Something shaped not by rage, but by injustice. The corridors that led to the Grand Pine Corridor, the Matsuno, Roka, were lined with scrolls depicting moments from nature. Cranes landing on snow, bamboo in the wind, a single koi fish beneath rippling water. These images, meant to inspire reflection and peace, flickered by as Asano walked in silence. His sandals moved with no hesitation, no sound. 2 guards bowed politely as he passed. None suspected that the air had already changed, not with sound, but with intent. Kira Yoshinaka was waiting. He stood with his back partially turned, his robes a dazzling array of white and crimson, the emblem of his house shimmering like frost upon silk. In one hand, he held a folded fan. In the other, invisible beneath his sleeve, a readiness for scorn. He had prepared more barbs, more rehearsed insults. He would deliver them like a noble striking a dog, then bask in the quiet applause of those too fearful or too bound by etiquette to protest. What he did not know, could not know, was that the well of Lord Asano's patience had run dry, that the stream of restraint, so carefully preserved, had turned to stone overnight. Kira opened his mouth to speak, to drop yet another insult cloaked in formal tone, but Asano moved first. Without a shout, without flourish, the young lord drew his wakizashi, the shorter of the 2 swords samurai always wore. It sang quietly against the air as it emerged from its sheath. And in the stillness of that sacred corridor, a place where no weapon was ever meant to be used, Lord Asano struck. The blade flashed in the candlelight. The sound was not dramatic, no clash of steel, no echoing thunder. It was the sound of cloth parting, of air moving swiftly. Kira stumbled back, his arm sliced. Blood soaked into the patterned silk of his robes. He cried out not from pain alone, but from disbelief. The insulted had become the attacker. Guards rushed in, their steps heavy now, breaking the spell of silence. Asano made no move to flee. He did not raise his sword again. He stood there, the blade lowered, his expression distant, as if something deep within him had been released, not with joy, but with resignation. He had not killed Kira. Perhaps he did not mean to. Or perhaps, in that moment, Fate intervened not to spare the guilty, but to doom the honorable. He was seized, of course. The act had been seen. Edo Castle was not a place where forgiveness was easily granted, especially not for drawing a blade within its walls. Word traveled like smoke. Ministers and officials whispered behind screens. Decisions were made swiftly, as they always are when power feels threatened. Asano was not granted a trial. By that evening, the shogun's decision had been delivered. Lord Asano Naganori was to commit seppuku ritual suicide before the sun rose again. No appeal, no delay, no comfort. The message was brought to him not by a friend, but by a messenger in court robes. The paper was unrolled with formality, read aloud in a voice that carried no warmth. Asano bowed his head. He did not protest. He did not ask for mercy. In the traditions he had been raised to honor, this was the only outcome. A samurai who drew his blade unlawfully must answer with his life. It was not seen as punishment, but as atonement, a final way to leave the world without shame. He was taken to the estate of a friend, a quiet compound surrounded by low stone walls and rows of plum trees just beginning to bloom. There, in a bare room lit by oil lamps, Lord Asano prepared. The rituals were known to him: a final bath, clean white robes, writing of one's final words, not a will, but a statement of soul. His brush moved slowly across the rice paper, the ink drying in delicate strokes. He wrote, not of hate, not of Kira, but of honor, of duty, of peace. 2 retainers stood by, one to bear witness, one to serve as second to end his suffering swiftly, cleanly, once the ritual cut had been made. The silence in the room was complete. Even the wind seemed to still itself in respect. The night was cool. The lanterns flickered like stars. The blade, short, curved, sacred, rested upon a square of silk. Asano bowed to it, then to the men, then to the world, and with no cry, no complaint, he knelt. It was over within minutes, and with him, something quiet died in the hearts of those who knew him. Far away in Akko, the news arrived with the speed of smoke, but the weight of stone. His retainers, samurai sworn to serve him even beyond death, gathered in the great hall of the castle. Oishi Yoshio stood at their center, the chamberlain, the leader, the man who had advised patience. Now his voice, always calm, always measured, rang differently. Not with rage, but with grief so deep it echoed. 47 samurai remained. 47 men, now masterless. In the eyes of the law, they were Ronin wavemen, drifters without a lord. In the eyes of honor, they were something else entirely. And in that cold hall, lit only by the faint orange glow of braziers, Oishi Yoshio bowed his head and said nothing, because vengeance, like tea, must steep, and snow, though soft, falls with purpose. The province of Akko had never been loud. Its hills rolled softly, like the folds of a sleeping kimono, and the wind that passed through its pines moved with a sound that was more breath than voice. But in the weeks following Lord Asano's death, that quiet changed. It grew heavier, not broken but filled with something unspoken, as if the earth itself had taken on the grief of its people, and every step upon the land was an echo of something lost. Inside the main hall of the castle, the air held a scent of old cedar and cold ash. The brazier in the center gave off a thin line of smoke, rising steadily toward the wooden ceiling, curling like thoughts that could not settle. Oishi Yoshio sat alone in the inner chamber, his legs folded beneath him, the sleeves of his robe neatly arranged across his lap. He had not spoken much since the news arrived, not to his family, not to the other retainers, not even to the shrine in his home, where he usually offered incense at dawn. His silence was not absence, it was preparation, like ink settling in a well. Outside the castle, the townspeople moved with slow deliberation. Shops still opened, children still played, the market still rang with quiet bartering, but everything was touched by restraint. Black ribbons hung from the wooden beams of sake stalls. The rice paper lanterns bore no color, only pale light. Even the laughter of the old women who washed vegetables by the river had grown subdued, their voices low, as if afraid to wake the spirit of the fallen lord. The retainers of Lord Asano, those now made Ronin, did not scatter as many thought they would. Instead, they waited, not together, but as if each were a grain of rice held in a pot just before the water boiled. Oishi gathered them not with commands, but with glances, with brief meetings behind closed doors, with quiet conversations under plum trees long after sunset. Each man carried the same wound, not only grief, but dishonor. For in the code of the samurai, a lord's shame is the shame of his men, and to live with that shame, without redemption, was a burden heavier than armor. They could not act immediately. Kira Yoshinaka, though wounded, had survived. He remained in Edo, protected by the shogunate, surrounded by guards. He had not been punished. In the eyes of the law, he had been the victim. But in the hearts of the Ronin, he was the destroyer of their master's name. And for that, justice had not yet spoken. Yet justice could not be rushed. Oishi knew this. He understood that vengeance taken in haste would lead to ruin not only for themselves, but for the memory of Lord Asano. They needed time. Time to plan. Time to disappear. Time to let the world believe that they had given up. So he ordered the castle doors opened. The domain was officially surrendered back to the shogunate. With great ceremony, the castle was closed. Papers were signed, seals pressed in red ink, keys handed over with 2 hands and low bows. The people of Eiko wept as the gates closed behind the last of the retainers. It was not the loss of stone or wood they mourned, it was the breaking of a line, the end of a name that had protected them. Farmers offered bowls of rice. Children left folded cranes. One old man played his bamboo flute for hours by the castle wall, not for others to hear, but for the wind. The Ronin scattered. Some became monks. Others took work as carpenters, as cloth merchants, as servants in distant provinces. They wore different names. They cut their hair. They let their armor rust. One sold charcoal on a street corner, coughing into his sleeves, pretending poverty. Another swept the steps of a small shrine with devotion so real that the priests wept when he left. They vanished, not out of fear, but out of necessity. Because vengeance, to be true, must be born not in fire, but in snow, cold, deliberate, waiting. Washi too disappeared. He moved to Kyoto, where he took on the name Kuranosuke and lived as a man broken by life. He frequented tea houses. He drank sake to excess. He stumbled through alleys singing old songs. People whispered that he had gone mad, that the loyal chamberlain of Akko had become a disgrace, that even he, the most disciplined of them all, had abandoned the code. But in truth, Oishi was watching the movements of Kira, watching the politics of Edo, watching the timing of the moon. Each night, when the city had folded into sleep, he would return to his small home, light a single candle, and opened the box where he kept a scroll, the list of 46 names. His men, each still waiting, each still ready. His son, Chikara, barely 16, had followed him into exile. The boy cleaned the small courtyard, gathered wood, poured tea. He did not ask questions. He did not weep. When his father looked at him, he saw not youth, but resolve. In the mornings, they practiced sword forms, not loudly, but slowly in silence. Each movement memorized by candlelight, each step a prayer. The seasons passed. Autumn turned the leaves to flame, and winter softened the rooftops with snow. New Year's came and went. The sake flowed. The bells rang 13 times, and still nothing. No word, no act. Just waiting. And then, one night, as the snow fell in thick, slow flakes, Oishi stood in the courtyard with a letter in hand. His expression did not change, but Chikara saw the way he folded it carefully, reverently, and placed it inside his robe. He looked up, and, for the first time in 2 years, he smiled. Snow blanketed Kyoto that night, like a breath held for too long, deep, white, and absolute. The city was quieter than usual. The sound of clogs on stone paths had softened into muffled taps, and the paper lanterns outside tea houses gave off a golden haze through falling flakes. Somewhere distant, a bamboo wind chime rang once, then stopped, silenced by snow collecting on its strings. It was the kind of night that asked the world to pause, a night where even memory moved slower. In the small house where Oishi Kuranosuke had hidden for 2 years, everything was prepared. No words had been spoken, yet the stillness of the walls, the scent of pine and iron, the neatly rolled scrolls and bundled robes all said the same thing. The waiting was over. The room glowed with the warm amber of oil lamps. Shadows flickered gently against the wooden walls, like the echoes of the past gathering one final time before vanishing. Oishi stood before a lacquered chest. He opened it with both hands and slowly lifted out his armor. It was not grand, not gleaming. The black lacquered plates bore scratches, not from recent battle, but from years of practice, years of discipline. He held the cuirass against the light, ran a hand across the cords, and nodded slightly, as if speaking to an old friend. His son, Chikara, entered quietly, bowing low. He, too, had grown in silence. The years had stripped him of childhood without ever taking his calm. He carried a bundle wrapped in indigo cloth, his own armor, lighter, but forged in the same pattern. The father and son looked at one another without a word, and something passed between them, not courage, not grief, but a steady agreement that nothing remained unfinished. As the night deepened, one by one, men began to appear. They came not with fanfare, not with shouts or horns or banners, but like shadows returning to their original shape. In silence, they gathered in the courtyard behind Oishi's home. Some wore straw cloaks thick with snow. Others bore small satchels wrapped tightly, their weapons hidden beneath robes. There were no greetings, no speeches, only eyes that met, recognizing not only a face but a purpose remembered. Of the 47, all had returned. Oishi moved through them slowly, placing a hand briefly on a shoulder here, nodding there. Each man bowed low, and in that bow was the weight of 2 years of exile, disguise, and self-control. Some had beards now. Others bore the calluses of manual labor, but all stood with the same quiet readiness. They were not here for glory. They were not here for revenge. They were here to restore what had been broken. Inside, hot tea was poured, not sake. The bitterness was grounding. The heat from the cups warmed their cold fingers. In the main room, a map was laid across a low table. It depicted the estate of Kira Yoshinaka, who now lived in Edo, in a large compound surrounded by guards. His home was not a fortress. It was not meant to withstand siege, but it was heavily watched. Oishi had spent months learning its layout. The placement of the gates, the shift changes of the guards, the sleeping quarters, the rear garden, the hidden exits. The plan was simple, but it had to be perfect. They would split into two groups. One would enter through the main gate, the other would approach from the rear. They would strike just before dawn, when the city was coldest and sleep deepest. No one was to harm innocents, only Kira, and any who fought to defend him. They carried with them a letter, a formal declaration of their purpose. It would be left behind after the act, addressed to the shogunate, explaining that this was not a crime, but an offering. Not murder, but correction. A sword drawn to write a final line. At midnight, they left Kyoto. They moved like river mist, slipping between towns, resting in farmhouses, never staying more than a night. Snow accompanied them all the way. The roads were narrow and slick, but none complained. Their armor was wrapped in cloth, their swords bound tightly. They traveled by foot, in pairs, in silence. Sometimes they passed travelers, monks, merchants, children, and always bowed, always smiled. None suspected what they carried. Their footsteps became part of the landscape, a pilgrimage made not for faith, but for fulfillment. By the time they reached Edo, dawn was still days away. They waited in the outskirts, in a secluded inn where the straw mats smelled faintly of rice husk and old cedar. Each man was given time to write a final letter to wives, to children, to ancestors. The ink was dark and deliberate. No flourish, no poetry, only truth. Some folded paper cranes with their letters, others placed a pinch of soil from their home province inside the envelope. Oishi, when he finished writing, stared at his scroll for a long time before sealing it with wax. He placed it in a wooden box, beside the one that held Lord Asano's final words. The past and the present now joined. The final night came. Oishi gathered the men one last time. They sat in a circle, legs crossed, backs straight, like monks before a sacred ritual. He did not speak loudly. His voice was soft even, like the falling snow outside. He reminded them of their vow, not of death, but of purpose. He spoke of Lord Asano's silence, of honor not as a shout, but as a breath held for years, then released all at once. He looked at each of them, not as warriors, but as brothers. Then he poured a cup of tea, raised it, and whispered, "Let the soul return." The men bowed, and then they slept, because tomorrow, history would awaken. The night was so quiet it seemed to fold time. Snow fell not in gusts, but in long, drifting silences, each flake tracing its own unhurried descent through the dark. Edo slept beneath this hush like a village carved in porcelain. The lanterns were out, the gates were closed, the bells had not rung since sundown. From the rooftops, where a layer of white softened every edge, the city resembled a scroll painting, motionless, minimal, perfect. And into this stillness came 47 men. They wore black, not polished, not adorned, but black like the underside of pine bark, matte and fibrous. Over their armor they draped cloaks of rough cloth, designed not for war, but for invisibility. Their sandals were bound in rags to muffle the sound of steps. Their breath came out in quiet clouds, that vanished almost as soon as they appeared. No one spoke, no one coughed, no blades were drawn, not yet. Oishi led the front group. His steps were deliberate, as though each footfall marked not just a path but a choice. With him were 23 men, including Chikara. The boy no longer looked like a boy. His eyes were not filled with fire that would have been too easy. Instead, they held stillness. The same stillness a stone lantern has when the wind passes around it, but cannot move it. They approached the main gate of Kira Yoshinaka's mansion, a tall wooden structure with a tiled roof curved like a resting hawk's wings. Snow clung to the ridge. Guards stood nearby, holding spears and dozing in the shadows of small braziers. The flicker of orange flame on their armor made them appear warm, but that illusion would not last. From the rear of the estate, the second group closed in, led by another retainer named Horibe Yasube, younger, sharper, but no less silent. Then, a signal, not a horn, not a cry, a single lantern, covered and uncovered twice. Oishi nodded. It began. The Ronin surged forward not with chaos, but with absolute control. The snow absorbed much of the sound, so the scuffle that followed sounded more like wind against shutters than battle. The guards fell, not slain where it wasn't necessary, only silenced. Some ran, some fought, but none understood how the dark had filled so suddenly with steel. The Ronin did not shout. There were no war cries. Every movement had been rehearsed in the mind 1,000 times. Swords emerged like parting reeds. Doors were breached not with fire, but with chisels, pushed open with care to avoid waking those who didn't need to wake. The household servants, women, children, all were spared. Oishi had ordered it. Inside the estate, the halls were warm with the last of the brazier's heat. Screens separated room from room, painted with scenes of cranes and reeds, tigers crossing bridges, mountains lost in cloud. The art trembled slightly as footsteps moved past it. Snow fell in through open doors, mixing with tatami mats, melting into them like spilled time. Kira's retainers fought to defend him, but they were unprepared. These were guards meant to keep out thieves, not ghosts of duty. One by one, they were disarmed, some crying for help, some frozen by the suddenness of justice in motion. The Ronin moved like a tide, no single wave too strong, but together, unstoppable. In the central chamber, a fire still burned in the brazier, half collapsed into glowing coals. The air smelled of sandalwood and fear. Kira was not there. But the room bore signs of his retreat. A fallen fan, a silk robe hastily discarded, a cup of untouched tea on a lacquer tray. The steam still rose from it, faintly. Oishi narrowed his eyes. They searched the rooms one by one, calmly, methodically. Each doorway was opened with care. Each room was treated as sacred, not for the man it might contain, but for the act that would follow. In one small chamber, a servant knelt, trembling, his hands raised. Oishi did not speak harshly. He asked, in a quiet voice, where Kira had gone. The man pointed a storage room, behind a screen painted with plum blossoms. 2 Ronin approached it. The door was slid open, and there he was, Kira Yoshinaka, the man who had sneered at Lord Asano, the man whose pettiness had destroyed a name. He sat on the floor, knees pulled to his chest, in an unpainted robe. His eyes were wide with disbelief. He had expected something like this once, but not now. Not after 2 years. Not after so long with no word. Oishi stepped forward. He bowed, not deeply, not in reverence, but in form, because form mattered even now, especially now. He spoke calmly, not cruelly. He offered Kira the same choice Asano had been denied, the chance to die with honor. A wakizashi was placed before him. The gesture was quiet, final, heavy with meaning, but Kira could not move. He trembled. He shook his head. His mouth opened, but no sound came. So Oishi nodded once. One of the Ronin, appointed as second, stepped forward. The blade flashed. It was over in a breath. The room fell still again, as if the walls had been holding their own breath and could now exhale. They did not cheer. They did not gloat. They wrapped Kira's head in white cloth and placed it inside a wooden box. Then they gathered what was left of the night and stepped into it. Not one man had fallen. Not one soul had wavered. And as they walked together, through snow that now seemed to glow faintly with the first light of dawn, they did not speak, because they knew the story was not yet finished. The snow was deeper now, as if the earth had waited for this moment before allowing itself to sleep completely. The dawn was still only a hint, not light, but the softest lifting of darkness, like a thought preparing to be remembered. The streets of Edo, touched by the slow blue-gray of early morning, were quiet, save for the sound of sandals pressing into new snow, not hurried, not dragging, but measured. 47 men walked as one. Their armor was damp, flecked with melted snow. The cords had frozen stiff in places, and their cloaks were now heavy with ice at the hems. But none stumbled, none spoke. The box they carried was small, wrapped in white silk, and held between two men with the care one gives to something sacred. Inside it lay the head of Kira Yoshinaka, not as a trophy, not as a boast, but as a symbol, an offering. They walked toward Sengaku-ji Temple, where Lord Asano had been buried 2 years earlier. The path led through narrow city lanes, over small wooden bridges glazed in ice, past the paper-shuttered homes of merchants still dreaming in their sleep. In some houses, a candle still burned low. In others, the coals had turned to gray. A rooster cried out once, distantly. Somewhere, a dog barked, but these were faint, like sounds remembered from childhood present but not important. People began to notice them. A fisherman heading to the market saw them first, men in black, walking silently through the snow, with swords at their sides and eyes that did not meet his. He froze, lowered his basket, and stepped aside. Then others looked from windows, from behind doorways, from alleys where laundry lines hung stiff with frost. They saw the faces of the 47. Some recognized them. Others only knew what they must be. No one stopped them. No one dared. And in that silence, the city bowed. Sengaku-ji stood at the base of a hill, wrapped in stone walls and quiet groves of pine. The snow had coated the temple roof like fine white cloth. Smoke curled from a single incense brazier near the gate, its scent carried on a wind that smelled faintly of stone and cedar. A monk stood waiting by the steps. He did not speak, only inclined his head and stepped aside. The Ronin ascended slowly, leaving behind a line of footprints crisp, deliberate, unbroken. At the graveside of Lord Asano, the snow had not yet been disturbed. The stone marker stood firm, its top brushed by pine needles and the soft shimmer of frost. No flowers had been placed recently, no incense lit. But now, all that would change. Oishi stepped forward, still holding the box. He knelt, and with movements so precise they seemed like part of a ritual older than words, he placed the silk-wrapped head before the grave of his master. He bowed low first with his hands, then with his entire body. Not quickly, not as gesture, but as prayer. The others followed, each kneeling in turn, pressing their foreheads to the snow, their breath rising like spirits released. They remained that way for a long time. The snow did not stop. It fell on shoulders, on helmets, on the dark lacquer of their armor. It covered their backs like a blessing, and still they bowed. Eventually, they rose. Each man lit a stick of incense and placed it at the foot of Lord Asano's grave. The smoke drifted upward in thin spirals, joining the pine wind and the temple scent. Then they stepped back and stood in silence. 47 men who had no more war left in them, no more vengeance, no more purpose, only peace. Oishi turned to the monks and spoke softly, requesting that they care for the grave, for the incense, for the offering that had been made. He handed over a pouch of coins, not gold, but silver, enough for many months of care. Then he bowed again, this time to the monks, and thanked them. There was no attempt to flee, no disguise. The Ronin did not hide their names. They waited calmly at the temple gate, and by midday, the shogunate had sent messengers. It did not take long for the story to travel. People whispered it like a sacred poem. The 47 had returned, completed their revenge, and surrendered. Some were awed. Others wept. A few were angry that honor had been placed above the law, but none were indifferent. Even those who believed the act criminal could not ignore its purity. The messengers arrived with papers bearing official seals. The Ronin were taken into custody with the same formality they had shown in their vengeance, not as criminals dragged away, but as men escorted into history. Each man bowed. Each followed without protest. None resisted. They were held separately, but they remained calm. And in the quiet rooms where they were confined, each Ronin was given ink, paper, and time to write their final reflections. Many wrote to family. Some wrote poems. A few wrote only a single name, Asano, and when the sentence finally came that they were to follow their lord in death, none spoke against it, because in their hearts they had already known. Their story had never been one of survival. It had always been a farewell, written slowly in snow. Time moved differently after the sentence was given. It did not rush, nor did it stall. It flowed like ink, from a careful brush, quiet, steady, unshaken by urgency. The 47 Ronin were not imprisoned in dark cells or dungeons. They were not bound in chains or dragged through crowds. They were held in the homes of high-ranking officials, each man under soft arrest, each treated with solemnity, because what they had done could not be handled by law alone. It had entered the space between justice and memory. Oishi Kuranosuke was confined in the residence of Lord Hosokawa, a man who had once walked the same political halls as Kira, who had known Asano from formal gatherings, and who now found himself the reluctant host of a living legend. The house was quiet. Its corridors were long and lined with bare pine wood. Outside the rooms where Oishi waited, snow had begun to melt, collecting in the gutters with soft dripping sounds, like the sighing of a roof finally allowed to breathe. Oishi spent his days in silence, not out of sorrow, but out of fullness. Each morning, he rose early and cleaned his room with careful hands, smoothing the tatami, folding his sleeping mat, shaking out the dust from his robe. He prepared his tea slowly, using the same movements he had practiced for decades. The whisk spun in the bowl with the grace of memory, not routine. He drank without hurry. Then he wrote. There were letters. One for his wife, whom he had left years before in the guise of disgrace. He wrote to her not with apology, but with gentle explanation. He told her that the shame he wore in Kyoto was not for her to carry, that every sake-soaked stumble, every false laughter in the tea houses had been a shield, that his heart had never once drifted. One letter was for his son Chikara, though the boy did not need it. They were held in separate houses, but Uishi trusted that Chikara understood. Still, he wrote of pride. Not pride in the sword or in vengeance, but in the silence the boy had kept, in the patience he had learned, in the dignity with which he now faced the world. He asked nothing of him, not remembrance, not forgiveness, only peace. The other Ronin wrote too. Some drew small ink paintings of landscapes, of cranes, of mountain paths disappearing into cloud. One man wrote nothing at all, but folded a piece of paper into a perfect lotus and placed it before the shrine in his room. Another carved his name into a strip of cedar, then burned it, letting the smoke rise like a farewell too heavy to carry in words. Visitors were allowed. Wives, children, old friends. They came bearing food, incense, winter flowers. There were no tears, not in public. Only long embraces, low bows, and words spoken in slow voices, as though language itself wished to linger a little longer. In one house, a daughter brushed her father's hair while he told her the story of Lord Asano's childhood. In another, a younger brother brought his sibling a folding fan, whispering that it had belonged to their mother. As the day of the ritual neared, the air changed, not with fear, but with gravity. The shogunate had decreed that all 47 were to commit seppuku, the honorable death. It would not be done in the street, nor in secret. It would be conducted according to custom, each man with his second, each in dignity. Some would be permitted to perform the ritual in the gardens of the residences that housed them, where plum trees had begun to bloom prematurely in the confused warmth of late winter. Oishi received the announcement as he knelt before his low table. The official who read it bowed deeply. His voice trembled not from cold, but from reverence. Oishi listened without reaction. When the reading ended, he simply nodded. He stood. He asked for writing materials. He prepared one final letter. It was addressed to Lord Asano. The brush moved slowly, deliberately. There were no flourishes, no calligraphy meant to impress, only steady strokes, like footsteps across old stone. I have done as you asked in silence. I now follow you in silence. He signed it with his name, and then he rested. He bathed. He dressed in white, not the bright white of ceremony, but a soft ivory hue like the underbelly of a crane's wing. His sleeves were tied back with strips of cloth. He drank tea one final time, lifting the bowl slowly, as if holding a memory in his hands. The warmth of the ceramic seeped into his fingers. He closed his eyes. When the hour arrived, the garden was swept clean. The snow had been pushed gently to the sides, forming walls of soft white around a flat patch of earth. A low cushion had been placed at the center, and next to it, a small square of fine silk. Upon that silk rested the blade short, curved, polished, until it reflected the gray of the sky. His second stood nearby, silent, dressed in simple brown robes. hands resting lightly on the hilt of his own sword. Oishi stepped into the garden. He bowed to the blade. Then he knelt. He did not hesitate, because this too was part of the path, and the path, once chosen, must be walked to its end. The snow continued to fall, gently, unmoving, eternal. In the days that followed, a deep stillness settled over Edo, not the stillness of snow, but the kind that lingers after something sacred has passed through. It was not marked by silence, but by quiet reverence, like the echo of a temple bell long after the bell itself has stopped ringing. The story of the 47 Ronin, once whispered in corners and behind sliding doors, now moved like wind across the streets, not shouted, not sung, but carried in the hearts of all who heard it. And no one spoke of it lightly. The shogunate had done what it believed necessary. The law had been upheld, order had been maintained, the sentence had been carried out with dignity, and yet, the act of the Ronin, the 2-year silence, the restraint, the deliberate purity of their revenge, had awakened something the law could not touch. A memory older than edicts. A feeling carved into the stone of shrines and the grain of wooden swords. Honor lived not in what was permitted, but in what was endured. At Sengakuji Temple, the earth was soft with thawing snow. The monks had prepared the ground, 47 plots, all in a long, gentle row beside the grave of Lord Asano. The head of Kira, offered in silence and buried with no ceremony, had been placed at the foot of Asano's grave as a final act of symbolic justice. No flags marked the spots. No grand memorials were erected. Only simple stone markers, each bearing the name of a man who had once chosen patience over fury, silence over spectacle. And yet, the people came. First in 2s and 3s, old soldiers with their sleeves tied back, merchants with wrapped parcels of rice, women leading children by the hand. They came bearing incense, flowers, and folded prayers. Some came to kneel, others to touch the stones with reverent hands. A few came simply to be near the place where the boundary between honor and death had been crossed with such deliberate grace. By spring, a path had formed. Worn into the grass by thousands of quiet steps, it wound gently through the temple grounds, curving past plum trees and stone lanterns dusted in moss. The air smelled of new blossoms and candle smoke. Monks swept it each morning, not to erase the footprints, but to prepare it for new ones. In time, it became known as the Path of Loyalty, not because of any signpost, but because every foot that passed over it did so, remembering the same story. The tombs were tended daily. The snow gave way to spring rain. The spring gave way to summer moss. And through it all, the caretakers lit incense each morning at dawn, even when no one watched. A tradition was born not by decree, but by shared memory. On the anniversary of their deaths, people began to gather in greater numbers. Lanterns were placed along the path. Children wrote poems on strips of paper and tied them to the trees. Samurai bowed low before the stones. And on those days, even the wind through the pine trees sounded like it carried names. The shogunate remained silent. They had executed the men, yes, but they had also allowed them their final act of dignity. And slowly, quietly, the state's silence became its own kind of respect. The graves were never defaced. No order was given to erase the memory. Perhaps even the rulers understood. Some stories were beyond decree. Chikara, Oishi's son, had been spared. He was just 16 when the act was committed, old enough to wield a sword. but young enough to be allowed mercy. The shogunate released him after a time. He did not return to a life of combat or politics. Instead, he retired to the countryside. He tended a garden. He taught children how to write poetry. He brewed tea with slow hands. And once each year, on the anniversary of his father's death, he walked the long road back to Edo, to the temple on the hill. There, he would kneel before the stone-marked Dashur Neitsanju Oishi Kuranosuke and place a single white chrysanthemum on the grave. He never stayed long. He never spoke. But every time he stood and turned to leave, he would pause just once to look at the sky, as if remembering that everything written in snow still reaches the heavens. The story of the 47 Ronin spread beyond Edo. It reached Kyoto, where old men recited it to children under maple trees. It reached distant provinces, where traveling monks retold it with soft voices and slow gestures, their hands tracing the arc of the blade, the stillness of waiting. It was told in woodblock prints, in puppet plays, in the slow cadence of bunraku narration, where each word fell like a leaf onto a drumbeat of memory. But most of all, it lived in the space between action and silence, in the tea that was poured in remembrance, in the snow that fell each winter on the stones, in the slow bow of a man standing before a name that was not his but could have been, because the tale of the 47 Ronin was never meant to be an epic of swords. It was always a meditation, on time, on loyalty, on the beauty of waiting without question, on the weight of doing what must be done and doing it slowly, long after the snow melted from their graves, long after the final plume of incense curled into the morning sky. The story of the 47 Ronin remained not frozen in time, but growing quietly beneath it, like roots that continue to stretch even when the tree is gone. Japan remembered them not because they had killed, but because of how they had waited. And in that waiting, they had redefined something that no decree or sword could fix in place: the meaning of honor. Bushido, the way of the warrior, had always been written between contradictions, between sword and scroll, between silence and action, between serving a lord and serving a deeper sense of right. For centuries, samurai had lived within this tension. Obedience to their daimyo was absolute, but so too was their inner code, the quiet call of justice, dignity, and moral rectitude. And in the actions of the 47, these two paths had collided. They had avenged their master, but defied the law. They had preserved his honor, but disobeyed the shogunate. They had chosen death not because it was required, but because it was right in a way that surpassed words. And so, the country was left with a question. Were they heroes or criminals? The answer did not come in a single voice. It came in the slow, deliberate way that Japanese culture holds contradiction like a bowl of tea, balanced, warm, both empty and full. Over time, their act came to be seen not as rebellion, but as the highest form of loyalty. A loyalty so pure that it needed no recognition, so complete that it ended with their deaths, not their reward. And so the concept of giri obligation, duty shifted slightly, became more textured. The story began to appear in places of teaching. In schools for the sons of warriors, the tale was recited not to encourage bloodshed, but to teach patience, discipline, devotion. In sword schools and dojos, the names of the 47 were inscribed on tablets hung in silence, next to the racks of wooden bakken. In temples, their likenesses were carved in small wooden figures, never smiling, never weeping, always still. Over the centuries, their story became Chushingura, the treasury of loyal retainers. Retold again and again, each time with slight variation, each telling revealing something new. Sometimes, Oishi was portrayed as a strategist, cool and calculating. Sometimes, he was drawn as a broken man, hiding tears in sake. The Ronin were shown as warriors, as monks, as ghosts of winter. Their silence echoed through kabuki plays, their names called in bunraku puppet chants, where drums beat softly beneath words like falling snow. People didn't just watch these plays, they bowed after them, because what they saw was not drama, it was devotion. The stone graves at Sengakuji remained untouched by time. Generations passed, wars came and went, emperors ruled and faded, but the simple row of markers beside Lord Asano's tomb stood firm. People still came, not just on anniversaries, but on quiet mornings, rainy afternoons, late nights when the world felt too loud and they needed to be reminded of something quieter, something steadier. Foreigners came too. Western visitors in the 19th century, wrapped in long coats and curiosity, stood beside the graves with their hats pressed to their chests. They could not read the kanji, but they felt the weight of what rested there. Some wrote in journals of the strange reverence they witnessed, not for victory, but for integrity. In time, statues were carved. Oishi stands in front of Sengakuji even now, in full armor, his hand resting not on the hilt of his sword, but on the hilt of silence. His eyes do not look out with pride, but with calm, as if watching the city that once watched him. Around him, the world continues. Trains rumble beneath the streets. School children in uniforms hurry past with bent umbrellas. Office workers walk briskly with phones in hand. But still, each day, at least one person stops. One person bows. Because stories like these do not fade. They settle into bone, into breath, into culture. And what began as an act of vengeance has become something softer, something slower, a meditation on patience, a reminder that the truest form of strength is not force, but the choice to endure. That to act with dignity, even when unseen, is itself a legacy. So when the snow falls over Edo, now Tokyo, and the wind moves through the temple pines, it carries not just cold, but memory of 47 footsteps, of one master, of a promise kept not in rage, but in reverent quiet. And in that quiet, Japan still listens. Behind the story of the 47, beneath the black armor and bowed heads, lived men, not statues, not names etched in stone, but men with calloused hands, with memories of warm kitchens, of laughter beneath autumn trees, of quiet evenings when the world was still whole. The tale of vengeance has often cast them as a single shape, a collective of loyalty, but in truth, they were each a story within the story. 47 silences, 47 winters, each with its own weight. Take Horibe Yasube, for instance. He was not born a samurai. He had been the son of a humble fencing instructor in Edo, raised among the clack of wooden swords and the scent of sweat soaked into tatami. His childhood had been filled with movement-precise drills, repeated kata, stern corrections, and the rare, quiet praise that lingered longer than a feast. He joined Lord Asano's service not through noble blood, but through earned skill. And though he could move with the grace of a crane in the midst of wind, he spoke little. His voice was soft, his eyes often turned toward the floor when praised. In the 2 years of waiting, he worked as a laborer at a lumber yard near Kyoto. His hands, once used to holding the balance of a blade, grew splintered and strong from carrying logs and planing beams. No one there knew his name. He walked with a slight limp feigned to appear weaker. At night, he would sit by the edge of the canal, eating rice with pickled radish, watching the reflection of lanterns shiver across the surface like lost stars. He spoke to no one, but in his pocket, folded 10 times over, he kept a tiny map of Kira's estate, drawn from memory. Then there was Okano Kinemon, who had been the oldest among the 47. Over 60 winters had passed through his life by the time they gathered again. His beard was white, his back slightly stooped, but his presence was still like a stone lantern in snow. He had served Lord Asano since his youth, and his devotion was not born of orders but of years. Kinemon had once been the one who taught younger retainers how to hold their swords, how to speak with restraint, how to walk without pride. When the attack was planned, he volunteered to lead the rear group not out of desire, but out of quiet duty. He knew he would not move quickly, but he would move steadily. And when the moment came, he struck only once, and it was enough. After the act, he wrote no final poem. He did not seek visitors. He spent his last days sitting by a small pond in the residence where he was held, feeding carp with small crumbles of rice, his gaze lost in the soft ripples that moved outward endlessly, like time. And of course, there was Chikara Oishi's son, 16 when it began, 18 when it ended. So much of his life had been a mirror, reflecting his father's resolve, his silence, his gaze. But beneath it, Chikara was still becoming, still folding the edges of manhood like a sheet of washi, careful not to tear what he didn't yet fully understand. In Kyoto, he had carried firewood, swept floors, learned how to disguise his stride. He had watched his father drink sake with fools and never break the mask, and he had learned, more than anything, what patience looked like when it was not glamorous, when it was heavy and plain and everyday. He never forgot the moment the signal was given, how the lantern flickered twice in the dark, how the world seemed to inhale and never exhale again. After the vengeance was done, Chikara had expected to die. He prepared for it, accepted it, but he was spared. The law saw youth, mercy, and so he lived. Yet for many years after, he said little of it. He lived near Mount Hiei, among trees and tea. His hands grew skilled at trimming bonsai. He took no students. He married once, quietly, and on his walks, he would sometimes pause at certain points in the forest and listen as if waiting to hear the crunch of 47 footsteps behind him once more. Each of the 47 had a story like that. Some had been scholars, others soldiers. One had loved poetry more than combat. Another had lost a brother in Asano's service and saw this final act not as revenge, but as reunion. Not one of them acted for gold, not one for glory. Each walked into snow knowing they would never walk out again. And that is what makes their silence so vast, because true loyalty does not need to explain itself. It simply stands, even as the world turns, even as the plum trees bloom again, even as centuries pass. In a temple courtyard in Tokyo, those names still rest beneath stone. And if you go there in the early morning, when the incense has just been lit and the city hasn't quite stirred, you might feel it, the weight not of death, but of stillness. 47 kinds of stillness, each its own sky, each its own story. The 47 Ronin may have died in the snow, their swords laid to rest and names etched in stone, but their story did not sleep. It traveled not in the gallop of messengers or in the pages of official records, but in the slower, deeper movements of culture. Like smoke from temple incense, it rose into every layer of Japanese life, clinging to fabric, to rhythm, to breath. And there it stayed. In the world of theater, their tale found its second life, and perhaps its truest one. The Chushingura, or the Treasury of Loyal Retainers, was first performed as a puppet play, Bunraku, in the year 1748, not even 50 years after the Ronin's final bow. In that form, their story was retold with haunting slowness. Each puppet, carved of cypress wood and painted with care, was operated by 3 men dressed in black, their faces concealed, their hands practiced in the art of invisible presence. The narrator Taiyu did not merely read. He chanted, sang, wept. His voice followed the arc of snow through the silence of revenge, then fell into stillness where honor rested. Audience members did not cheer. They listened, because the pauses were just as important as the words. Kabuki soon followed, with its vivid robes, elaborate makeup, and thunderous poses frozen in moments of intense emotion. Kabuki took the tale and made it live again, bold and bright, yet still solemn beneath the color. Oishi, portrayed as a man of controlled grief. Chikara, trembling in silence as he watches his father prepare for death. Kira, often rewritten with more villainy than truth, because audiences needed someone to stand against the purity of the Ronin. And yet, even with the drama, the plays preserved something essential. They never mocked. They never trivialized. The 47 were not turned into entertainment, but into ritual. Each performance was a kind of offering, a retelling that reaffirmed something deeper than spectacle. Even in the brightest kabuki theater, as lanterns flickered and shamisen strings vibrated with tension, there remained an invisible thread connecting every actor, every watcher, back to a winter morning at Sengakuji. Theaters were not the only places the story took root. In temples, carved tablets, called ima small wooden plaques, upon which prayers are written, began to appear bearing the names of the Ronin. Visitors asked not for wealth or luck, but for strength, patience, clarity in difficult decisions. Students facing exams or moral crossroads wrote poems in their honor. Some asked for courage. Others simply asked to be like them, if only in stillness. In poetry, the Ronin became a metaphor. A haiku might mention falling snow, but the snow is not snow, it is duty. A tanka might mention the sound of clogs in the night, but it is not movement, it is silence, traveling with purpose. Writers and artists began to see them not as men, but as shapes within the soul. Woodblock prince ukiyo-e depicted Oishi kneeling under moonlight, or all 47 in formation, walking single file across a narrow bridge with mist curling around their feet. In one famous image, Kira sleeps in his chambers, while the shadows on his wall form the silhouettes of swordsmen approaching, not real, not yet, but inevitable. Even the architecture of Japan began to echo their story. In some samurai households, a small alcove was dedicated to loyalty, not to the Ronin by name, but to the spirit they embodied. A single scroll, a blade laid horizontally, and a branch of pine. Simple, still, complete. Nothing more was needed because the absence of clutter was itself a statement. Schools began to teach the story in ethics lessons, not as history, but as reflection. Children were not taught to imitate the act. They were taught to understand the patience, the restraint, the moral cost of action. They discussed questions that had no simple answers. Was it right to break the law to uphold a deeper code? Can loyalty go too far? What does it mean to serve and to stop serving only after the soul is satisfied, not the world? And so, generation by generation, the Ronin remained, not as sword-swinging warriors frozen in time, but as a mirror, a still surface that asked the watcher to pause and see themselves reflected in the silence. Some saw resolve, others saw sadness. Many saw both, because the story did not command, it invited, slowly, gently, like snow against the sleeve of a traveler who has not yet decided which path to follow. Even modernity could not erase them. After the war, as Tokyo rebuilt itself in concrete and steel, Sengakuji remained unchanged. The gravestones, worn by time and touched by hands that came from every prefecture, still stood beneath pine trees that whispered softly in wind. People now came in suits and sneakers, carrying smartphones instead of scrolls. But they still came. They still bowed. They still lit incense. And in the brief stillness between the lighting of the match and the rise of the first smoke, the world even now holds its breath. There is a moment in winter, just before the thaw begins, when the snow still lies thick on temple roofs, but the birds have started to return. A silence that is not final, but full like a long breath held before speaking a single word. That is where the story of the 47 Ronin rests now. Not in pages, not in stone, but in this moment of stillness, a hush that lingers, like incense long after the stick has burned away. Because legends do not end. They settle. They become part of the rhythm beneath things. Even now, the footsteps of those men seem to echo on cold stone paths before dawn. You might not hear them with your ears, but if you walk slow enough, if you let the world quiet around you, you may feel them in the soles of your feet. The way your breath slows near a shrine, the way your hands move with care when lighting a candle. That is how memory lives, not in the mind alone, but in gesture. Sengakuji still opens its gates at sunrise. There is no ceremony, no fanfare, just the groan of old wood, the brushing of wind through pine. The graves are simple, flat stone, vertical markers, the names carved deeply but without embellishment. Visitors come alone or with a friend. Sometimes a grandparent holds the hand of a child and whispers the story, not to teach, but to pass. As one might pass a cup of tea, in the early light, shadows move softly across the markers. The sun climbs slowly behind the eaves. Incense smoke curls in quiet spirals, then vanishes. And in that quiet, you realize something. The story was never really about vengeance. Not truly. Vengeance is sharp, fast, loud. But this was something else. It was about time, about holding a promise through seasons, about choosing dignity over comfort, about carrying the unbearable weight of silence, and never once setting it down. These men lived for 2 years with nothing but memory and intent. They allowed themselves to become forgotten, mocked, pitied, all so that the purity of their act would not be corrupted by haste. They wore their devotion like snow wears the rooftops of Edo quietly, slowly, in a layer so soft it can barely be seen, until suddenly the whole world is white with it. And when the time came, they moved as one, not because they were commanded, but because they had already decided together, and alone, in the quiet space between law and soul. Even after 3 centuries, their silence speaks. In museums, where old blades are kept behind glass, visitors lean in and stare not at the weapons, but at the names engraved in the metal. In literature, where the phrase true loyalty appears, it carries the shadow of their walk through snow. In Japan's national memory, where courage is often defined not by battle, but by restraint. And in the eyes of those who pause on their morning commute, passing through Sengaku-ji on the way to another hurried day, there is sometimes a stillness, a breath caught in the chest, a bowed head, not because they were taught to do it, but because something ancient in them remembers what it means to follow through, to finish something not for reward, not even for recognition, but because it is right, to kneel before a grave, blade set gently on silk, to stand when the task is done, to walk away without turning back. In the end, the legacy of the 47 Ronin is not one of death, but of shape, the shape of a man kneeling in snow, the shape of a promise kept, the shape of 47 shadows walking into history side by side, never needing to speak again. And in that shape, we find peace. So if tonight you sleep beneath a roof, with wind at the window and the hush of snow in your dreams, know that their story is there too. Not loud, not insistent, just present, like a steady breath, like a path still walked, like 47 footsteps in snow, each one soft, each one certain, each one still walking,